Hey everybody, welcome to Unstuck Kids Speak Out episode 11. Can't believe we've done this for almost a year, which is fantastic and shows you how fast time flies. But today I'm really excited because somebody that I've known for a few years will be joining me, and we get to talk about OCD, how it affected school, and all sorts of different issues. So if you are watching this on the replay, feel free to add comments and we will answer them no matter when you see this. And if you are joining us now, feel free to like and share and comment. We are here to help. Shira, who will be joining me very shortly, she has a lot of information and knowledge and a lot of personal experience with obsessive compulsive disorder, and she'll be really helpful for you. So I see that she is here, and we will go to inviting her in a second. Hold on. All right. Shira, join us here, and I'm looking forward to the vision. Again, like I said, feel free to like and share and comment this live stream. And hi, Shira, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm very good. Let me just turn up my sound so it's all the way up. Connection okay?
Yep.
Very cool. So this is really fun for me because I think I'm trying to remember, did we meet you in Boston at the OCD conference or in Chicago?
It was Chicago. We didn't get to go to Boston. We didn't know about the IOCDF in 2015, believe it or not.
So Chicago was your first conference?
Yeah, it was Chicago.
Oh, very cool. So then we've been friends with friends online and known each other, and parents known each other for a few years. So it's really cool to have you on here. And I know we just saw each other last month in DC. But I would love you to talk a little bit about OCD what you remember when it first began, and like how it first came into your life, even if you had no idea it was called OCD.
Okay. So, I mean, I was diagnosed, to give some perspective, when I was 9, but I can remember being like 4 or 5 and having these worries about throwing up. And I remember there was this little prayer I would do in my head that I would say over and over again. I never told my parents, and it didn't seem like something weird. It was just something that I did. And so I never thought to tell them about it. And then when I was 9 was when other people recognized it. Something was wrong. I was losing weight at a rapid pace. And that's when my psychiatrist at the time, who had just diagnosed me with generalized anxiety, realized that I was timing how long it took for me to eat meals, and that's when they diagnosed it.
So they noticed it based on like your behavior with food?
Yeah, they noticed it because there was an overt ritual, and all my rituals were mental up until that point.
Oh, really? So yeah. Everything, you were able to kind of hide it for it sounds like a year or so.
Well, I was 9 at the time I was diagnosed, but I had been experiencing symptoms since I was 5, at least.
And you're, so then we'll say from 5 to 9, 5 to 10, your parents were kind of accommodating you or working around you or trying to figure out, why is she acting the way she is and how do we help?
Yeah, but I mean, I feel like it was really when I was 8 when things started to like really ramp up for me. When that was at the point where they got me my first therapist, but it was just for anxiety. They had no idea like what was going on.
And the first therapist, if it was an anxiety therapist, was probably working and you were young, so they were probably having you draw pictures. Was it kind of like art therapy and talk therapy?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And how did OCD work mostly affect you at home? Was it at school? Was it a mixture outside, friends? Like, how did it kind of also affect your life other than, eating and food?
Oh, I mean, it affected everything. I didn't realize it at the time that was making me depressed. I wasn't aware of it, but like my motivation in school was dropping. I was in 3rd grade at the time. My mom ended up pulling me out of school in November of 3rd grade, but I do remember getting like, I was never a big school person when I was younger, but I was getting like 70s, and my teacher was having to talk to my parents about me just being like totally off in my own world. I had close friends like in elementary school and early elementary school, and they just like started like I started to feel this distance between them, and I just felt like I had this like burden that like they didn't understand. And I don't want that to sound like, oh, like I had this thing and they just wouldn't understand, like I was better than them somehow. I certainly didn't feel better than them. They just couldn't understand this sort of thing. And slowly, as I became more sick and my friends understood less and less, I lost some friendships.
Yeah, well, I mean that tends to happen. I would so I think the terminology of using sick is interesting because I don't know if that came from like like how you explained it to your friends or hey Kevin, how are you? Good to meet you. Well, yeah, well, we can definitely talk about emetophobia shortly. But guys, if you feel free to share this out, ask comments. We're just kind of getting a little feel for kind of how OCD came into Shira's life. And so when you say sick, what would that like? It wasn't you didn't have a cold. It wasn't the flu. But what how would that was that words your friends used or like how would you talk about that?
Yeah, I don't think my friends really knew. It was more that I was becoming more distant. When I say sick, my parents and I have referred it to that when I first started getting symptoms, because I was also getting physically sick. I was losing weight and it was physically harming my body. I couldn't do things physically. So I think that's sort of where that comes from. I don't think I use it with any particular intent behind it. It's just something that, because it is being sick in a way. I mean, it's something going on in your mind and sometimes in your body that's affecting what you're doing. It's making it harder to do other things, and I would totally compare it to having a physical illness.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was clearly affecting your strength, and
Yeah.
I'm sure it disrupted your sleep. Were there certain like foods you would avoid? Did you when you said your rituals were timed with food? It was like you had to eat at noon. Was it like even numbers, odd numbers, those type of things?
No, it was just these exact times and these exact amount of times. And I should sort of put a disclaimer out there that my food stuff has recently had a little comeback. So I'm not like, this is not something that I'm past in my life by any means. It's certainly manageable now. But I had certain times that I had to eat 3 meals. They had to be portioned. I had to know exactly how much I was eating. So if I was eating a sandwich and it was cut in half, I was either eating half of the sandwich or the whole sandwich. I was not eating until I was full. I was eating until I knew exactly how much I had eaten and it was not too much. I would eat breakfast anytime between 7 and 8, lunch between 11:45 and 12:45, and it had to take 10 minutes, no less than 10 minutes. Dinner was at 6 o'clock at the earliest, and it also had to take between 10 and 15 minutes. And I would not eat anything else.
So then you not only had like these hour blocks down, but you had specific like instances where like I would imagine even if you had one bite of food left and 10 minutes were up, you were probably watching the clock or had a timer or something like that. And it was like, oh, we're done.
No, I mean, I would finish because I needed to know exactly how much. So, it was, yeah.
So then talk to me about when, you first might have heard the term OCD and how that was explained to you. And, were there things that you like books that you read or, how did your therapist explain it to you or your parents?
It's funny. I don't remember when somebody told me that I had OCD. I know the therapist who I was working with told me and my family, but I never actually I don't have a memory of anyone telling me. There's just a point when I was about 9 or 10 that I knew that I had it. Like, that's what I know that's kind of a disappointing answer, but I honestly don't remember. I think in that point in my life, I was so like in my own world that like whenever someone told me, it didn't stick out in my head. I don't know.
And did you immediately like switch therapists? Did you have to like drive an hour in order to find somebody, or did you stick with the same person? How did that kind of initially work?
The therapist I was working with at the time lives approximately like 3 minutes from my current house, so it was great. And he actually treated OCD. We knew him as an expert at the time. Obviously, I'm not going to go out and say any names, but what he is not was not up to date on all of the research. Turned out he did get me out of going to the hospital for being underweight, so that was good. So no, short answer is I stayed with the therapist I had for the time being.
Hey Tina, thank you for your comment. We appreciate it. And I actually want to quickly, because Kevin's comment was, I want to address that. So talk to me about, I always screw this up, metaphobia. Is that something that you dealt with? Because you've met Vanessa. My daughter Vanessa certainly deals with it. It's an issue that continues, and actually to a point you just made before about not being 100% fine with food issues, or I think one of the things that we learned as parents, and I think she learned, is that like OCD issues crop up, and you might overcome something at one point, but it may crop in at another point, and it's about understanding, noticing it, and then understanding how to kind of work around it and fight back again against it. So it's almost like a constant vigilance as opposed to be cured.
So how did I just talk about metaphobia? Sorry.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I mean, like I said, I remember being afraid of it starting at the age of probably 5. I could give you the exact time of year, age, location, and what I have eaten every time I've thrown up that I can remember, because my mind catalogs it as important. It got to the point a little over a year ago where I would take up to I took 4 different antacids, and I took them repeatedly throughout the day to the point where it was actually damaging my gut. So it was counterintuitive, but it got pretty bad. It's definitely been a major part of my life. It's gotten to the point now where it doesn't affect me on a daily basis. It still gets to me occasionally if I'm not feeling well, but for the most part, it's not as relevant.
Where if you were at school and somebody, you heard one of your friends said, "Oh, I just had the flu and I threw up," or if somebody threw up in school, would that bother you, and that person bother you?
Oh, you mean in the past?
Yeah, or in general.
Oh yeah, God. No, it was terrifying. I mean, like, and it's hard when you're a little kid, especially when no one knows, because there's really nothing you can do in a classroom. When I remember this kid saying like, "Oh, I had the stomach flu this weekend and I threw up twice," and some other kid was like, "What did it look like?" Because they're like little kids, and like they're little kids, and everyone else was like having this whole conversation about it, and I was just like standing at the end of the hall with like freaking out. Like I would just avoid that person as much as possible. Be at the other side of the room, as much
Was
as
there something that is it something that might have gone away over time with this specific person, or you had to do something, like was there a ritual around kind of accepting that person was fine or better, or was that person just like completely contaminated for the rest of the time that you knew them?
I never had a contamination thing. I never felt things contaminated, and I feel like that's something that is kind of unique to me in that regard. But there were a couple of people, I remember specifically one person that I remembered as the person who threw up, and so he had this vibe that I just didn't like because of that. And I could tell you the exact encounters I've had if I've ever seen someone throw up. Like, I could tell you like because I remember it, but I never had like contamination stuff with that. No, that it would go away with time.
And so, so folks, if you want to ask questions, feel free. We're kind of having a free-flowing discussion here. I want to get a bit of Shira's story, so I'll kind of weave in and work out, but I will work in your questions whenever you want, and feel free to share this out or share it to a group you might know or person you might think should watch it even now or in the replay. So we talked a little bit about school. This is like elementary school, middle school area. How was your family dealing with it when you're you're 9, 10, 11 years old, OCD is big in your life, you're going to therapy, but how was it being handled at home, and how did it kind of work out that way?
One of the big issues I feel like today is that even the therapists who their job is treating OCD, that's what they do and they're great at it, there are very few resources for parents. And so my parents, like most parents, they're accommodating. And at the time, maybe the research wasn't what it is today. And they would, they would take me to the 2 restaurants I would eat at, and they would have the waiter remake my meal if they didn't make it right, or they would take me to the doctor if I thought I was going to throw up, when in reality it was just nerves. Because that's what a parent is told to do. I mean, to take care of their kid, but it's counterintuitive with OCD, as I'm sure you know. And
yeah,
it was never a huge problem. It wasn't until recently though that my parents have actually had therapists of mine who have been able to give them like the coaching they need, which I think is something that is needed a lot with parents because it's really hard to deal with.
Yeah, like training for mom and dad. So you're just kind of like tuning in, when Shira's talking about OCD treatment being counterintuitive, her parents were trying to get her to eat because that's what, our kid needs to eat. So if she only likes these 2 restaurants or these 2 foods, that's what we're going to feed her. And OCD therapy, you kind of work on not accommodating that issue. So yes, you would not want your kid to be malnourished or not fed, but you would work on things that disrupted OCD, and you don't want it to take over your life. Jay, it's interesting that you write that question about the TV show Monk. My daughter Vanessa, who has OCD, absolutely loves it, thinks it's hilarious, but less so that the OCD is kind of like a small part of it for her, whereas myself and my wife, we feel like the show glosses over the issues and makes it funny and light and probably puts it in a bad way. But it's so I think it can be both. It brings awareness to OCD. My daughter, who's been through therapy, understands it. We thought would hate it, and she absolutely loves it because she loves quirky detective shows. So I don't know if you ever saw that show, Shira, if you have an opinion on Monk.
No, I haven't seen it.
He's a detective, but his shtick is that he has OCD, so he has weird yeah.
So he's got OCD like superpowers.
It's kind of like classic stuff, like he has to wash his hands a lot and rub things, but and he does kind of weird exposures, but they don't treat it that way. So that does it, but it brings light to the issue. Howie, I know, Jay, he's been in therapy, and he is in therapy. From what I've read, it sounds like his family accommodates him a lot. Like, I believe when somebody's ill, he like moves out of the house, and that is something that would be counterintuitive to therapy, or that you would work up not to doing. But I really can't speak to him as much. All right, so then you're getting into how did therapy first work out? What are some of the things you did? Did you understand exposures, or like how did kind of that your therapy begin when you were younger? And then I want to get to some of the stuff that you've been doing recently.
Okay, so my first exposure, I remember one of the first exposures I did. I had this, like, I don't know if you'd call it like magical. It wasn't magical thinking. I don't know what you'd call it. Maybe false memory, where if I touched a food, I had the conception or the worry that I had actually eaten it. So, and I couldn't eat anything out of place, so I would avoid touching any food. So I remember the first exposure I remember doing is sitting in this leather chair, and so I'm in the chair. Here's the arm of the chair, and here's an almond, and so I had to sit with the almond on the armrest of the chair, and slowly they moved the almond closer and closer until I was touching it. We worked up to foods that were harder, which were like junk foods and food with sugar. You can't ask me the logic behind this because I don't have it. It was just a rule that my OCD made for me. And eventually I would do things like take Oreos, twist them open, and I would stick them on my tongue and hold them there and then take it out and just sit with that feeling of having maybe swallowed something. Who knows? And sit with that.
And it was the
It
idea.
worked.
They were kind of getting you used to understanding that the foods that you might have been afraid of weren't going to necessarily hurt you or do exactly what you thought they were going to do.
Yeah, just getting used to it. And then also, of course, I would do exposures a lot at home, working on those, but also working on eating actual, like going to different places, eating more food at home that my parents made.
Did you need to get out of the time thing? So, you know, you were talking about having to eat in 10 minutes. Did you suddenly have to only eat an hour?
I had a watch. I wore it everywhere, and I would just sit and I would eat like this, staring at my watch. I don't remember when the watch went. It went at some point, and I would just use the clocks around me. And then eventually they'd cover the clocks around me, and yeah.
And the idea was that you needed to take longer than 10 minutes to eat.
Or the idea was that I didn't know how long it was taking.
Okay. Okay. So it was more about the time and less about the act exactly being 10 minutes or so like that. It was more the focus on a clock as opposed to doing it in a certain amount of time.
It was about knowing that I had done it in a certain amount of time. I couldn't take too long or too short, so I would look at the clock to make sure that I stayed within the parameters that my OCD was telling me to stay within. And so without the clock, I was unsure of that. So, you know, it's the uncertainty thing.
So I think one of the things you said earlier is interesting because you kind of said when they told you OCD, you believed it, you knew it was real. And there are a lot of kids that I've talked to that like didn't believe it. And some of like the first hurdle they had to jump over was understanding that OCD is a thing. You're not the only kid alone. Yeah. But when you're going through this, did you you mentioned before that some of your friends, you lost some friendships, your friends didn't necessarily understand. How did you feel separate? Did you feel different? Did you just retreat into your home or your with like depression or like how did it make you feel different understanding that you had OCD? I'm just trying to find like how when it was when you were dealing with it earlier, how you kind of handle it with friends and things.
It wasn't really the notion of having OCD. It was just the notion of having this weight on my shoulders that other kids my age, or I should not make assumptions, I should say most other kids my age weren't dealing with at that point in their lives, especially since I was relatively early onset. I remember I would just get frustrated because my friends just didn't understand. Even I had this one distinct memory, and I was probably a preteen at this time. I was talking to my friend, and she was like, it was summer. She was like, oh, how's your summer going? And I was like, oh, it's been a hard day. Like, I've been really anxious. And she looks at me and she goes, oh, well, it's summer. Like, what do you have to be anxious about? And that was a key moment in my life where I sort of realized, like, wow, like, other people just don't, a lot of people don't have that. And it just sort of, it did make me feel a little bit alone.
Did it help when you when was the first time you remember meeting other people with OCD and or realizing that other kids had it too, and or it was common?
I was at a relatively small school after I dropped out of third grade. My mom pulled me out. And I knew of some kids who had OCD at my school because my parents were like, this is, other people have this, and I knew of some kids who had OCD, but I never really I never really talked to them about it. When I was 14, my therapist at the time had an OCD and perfectionism support group that I started, or that she started, and I joined. There were only a few other kids, and that was the first experience I had talking, that I remember talking one-on-one with other kids with OCD.
Well, that's cool. And did it kind of make you feel like, okay, you know, there's community or there's kinship here with other people?
Yeah, no, definitely. It really, like, it wasn't until I started, when I went to the OCD conference was the first time I was like, oh, holy God, like, there's so much. There's so many people that are dealing with similar things, which I know is an experience that lots of people have, but yeah.
So Jay, OCD generally, um, there are kids that I know that depends, sometimes it goes with other things. But there are kids that can get special consideration like a 504, an IEP, depending on how it affects their life. In general, I don't know if it's some kids might be homeschooled for if it's really severe and the issues are kind of working up to school. Sounds like Shira was homeschooled a little bit and then kind of went back to school. It's not like kids would go to a special school for it, so it's not handled like like um, like a learning disability in that way. But some kids might get special accommodations to help them. Let's say if it had to do with being a perfectionist and making a test perfect, having a little more time, things like that. Which leads me to actually something that we were talking about offline, perfectionism. You were saying that kind of worked its way into school with you, maybe when you got a little older, Shira? We might have lost the connection. So we're going to talk for a second. I think she'll come back and we'll invite her in. But this is Unstuck Kids Speak Out. I take once a month, I talk to a kid with OCD. It gets a chance for parents and anyone else that's watching to kind of ask a kid who I think is a kid expert, has gone through therapy, understands what it's like, knows what it's like to be vigilant about OCD therapy. And sometimes it can be really helpful for kids, families, parents to understand that, hey, there are others that have gone through it, and maybe I can ask questions and get some learnings for it. So, Shira, if you're there, just add another comment, and I'll invite you back in. In the meantime, if anybody's got a question, feel free. If you're just joining for the first time, my name is Chris Bear. I produced a film called Unstuck, an OCD Kids movie. That's where the page is that you're watching this. And it deals with 6 kids who have OCD, and the film talks about how it affected their lives, how it affected their family, and then how through therapy they kind of were able to overcome their issues and understand it better and become kind of really on another side, get back in control of their life. So meeting so many kids when we were filming the movie, I realized that there were just so many kids that have a lot of insight. There's always something I learned from this, and I figured let's give kids a chance to talk about their issues in other ways. So like I said, feel free to comment, ask questions, things like that. And I'm happy to, Sure, if you're just watching, jump right back in. I can't answer the text that you just sent. If you have any questions about obsessions, compulsions, how OCD is treated, how you deal with it as a family, I am in Brooklyn, New York. You would think that in a big city there would be a lot of places to get treatment. 5 years ago when my daughter was diagnosed, we still had to go into Manhattan and ride the subway 45 minutes to get therapy. And then we did a free program kind of in Upper Manhattan, which was like an hour and a half away. So even though in the big city you would think there would be a lot of resources, there wasn't a parent support group. We had to start that. So I understand how hard it is to get treatment and find people that can help you out and find specialists. One of the problems with OCD therapy is that you find that somebody might say they treat it, but they don't necessarily, they're not trained in specifically how to treat obsessive compulsive disorder, or they haven't gone through a training called exposure and response prevention therapy, which is a kind of CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy. So normally therapists are trained in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and usually they will, there's kind of extra training to learn exposure and response prevention therapy, which is the gold standard treatment for OCD. Shira, if you can, um, yeah, I just need to re-invite you. So just add another comment. Let me go back to the beginning and see if I can invite you back in. Yes, okay, I see you. Um, and so Shira's going to join us again. Cool.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
Sometimes that happens with Wi-Fi. So if that happens again, just jump back on, give me a comment, and then I can jump you back in.
All right.
So we were just talking about, I was kind of talking about school and perfectionism, and I know we had mentioned that was an issue that you dealt with. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's funny because OCD has always had this sort of all or nothing approach with me. When I was in elementary school and all throughout middle school, I had horrible grades. My grades were awful. I just didn't care. I couldn't care less about school. And then people told me, like, you're gonna like high school. It's gonna be hard, like with grades like this. And so there was a switch that flipped in that summer, and I was like, starting in 9th grade, I'm gonna get perfect grades. All my grades are gonna be perfect. And then they had to be perfect. There's this blessing and a curse that is the internet these days, and all of our grades are put online. And so I started checking them. I would ask teachers, like, hey, is this okay? Does this look okay? Are you sure this looks okay? Before I turned it in. Mm-hmm. And this is something I'm grappling with right now still, but I started checking my grades online up 20 plus times a day. It just became, all of a sudden, it was this big issue. I would have breakdowns over it.
To see if grades were posted? Like you were anxious and waiting to see what you did? Like the grade you got?
Yeah, I would just check it over and over again.
And when those grades were posted, let's say, were you disappointed if you didn't get a 99, or was it like as soon as they were posted, you were fine regardless of the grade you got?
Oh no, I needed to get a good grade. I wouldn't say it fluctuated over time. When it first started, I was fine. Math has never been my best subject. If I was in the high 80s in math, I was okay. Every other class needed to be in the high 90s. And if I got like a bad grade on a test, I would text my parents, which is a compulsion that I had and still struggle with sometimes, is using them as a safety blanket. I'll text them. I would say, like, I got a 70 on this test. Like, what do I do? Help me. Like, and I would freak out.
The question you had about the different school subjects, that's what I was curious about. If it was more about the writing subjects, having a perfect paper as opposed to just any subject. But it's interesting that it was the kind of grades you were okay with in subjects that you were maybe not so strong in, but it still was about understanding your grades. And then, if you want tutors, were you trying to be perfect in the way that you were studying more? And like, as soon as you got an assignment, you had to complete it and rewrite it.
It was about the numbers. It wasn't a number problem, but it was about the grade itself. And there was some, and there is some aspect of like worrying about the impact it's going to have on my future. But I think for the most part, it was a just right thing. I wanted it to be, I wanted to look at my report card and see a good score for everything. I wanted to say, okay, I have all A pluses in these classes, and it just felt good, and I wanted it to feel comfortable.
And how were you able to kind of work on that or fight that? I mean, was the therapy like you have to get a D?
It's funny because this is an issue that I'm just starting to get it addressed. It was always sort of pushed to the back, if I'm being honest, by other things. Because it was impacting my life the least out of all the issues at the time. Right now, what I'm working on is checking my grades less, and trying to just reduce those behaviors, reduce asking the teacher, and just turning in what I do, whatever I do without double checking, just sitting with that.
Is it kind of being okay with turning in something that may not be perfect, and or also realizing like you know the subject and therefore you don't have to, obsess over it because you kind of know it?
Yeah, and it's also just sort of this like, there's this values aspect to it too that I talked to my current therapist about. He was like, we were talking about the high standards that like schools hold kids to these days, and I was talking about how, yeah, no, like I don't agree with it, like people are putting way too much pressure on kids, this is ridiculous, all this emphasis that goes onto this. And he was like, well, this really isn't a value of yours, is it? Like you seem so invested in something that really isn't something that you care about as yourself. And I was like, yeah. So right now I'm really just working on keeping that in mind, keeping in mind that that is not a value that I have, and that every time I want to go check a grade, thinking, hold up, like I'm not a big fan of the public school system as it is. Like, why am I giving this so much of my energy?
Does it get harder for you when you might have a stressful time, in school generally, once, there might be a big test at the end of a quarter, or a big paper that your teacher says is going to be 30% of your final grade or something like that? Does it get harder for you? Does OCD tend to get worse when there's a stressful situation in general?
Yeah. Like this week, I'm going into a week with 5 tests. So it's definitely a stressful time. For sure. Yeah.
How, so the fact that you understand that it's going to be stressful, are you approaching the week in a different way?
Yeah. So I know we're talking something about like accommodations. I'm lucky to have a really good relationship with like my special ed counselors. And like, I'm definitely going to be asking for some extensions. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that, I mean, so I want to actually follow up with that in a second. Jay, to answer your question, I think the diagnosis for OCD is a test called, I believe it's called like the Yale Brown
yeah,
Obsessive
Yale Brown
Scale or
Obsessive
something.
Compulsive Scale.
Right. And it's like an
I
hour and a half test with kids. Like the therapist will sit with a kid for an hour, and then they'll sit with the parents and kind of like ask you the similar questions to get an idea of how OCD, if it is OCD or not. But I think the awareness of OCD is becoming it's that people's therapist schools are becoming more aware of it. There's a little more resources that are going to come out about it. So perhaps you might get it more diagnosed. I mean, basically what they say is I've seen stats between in our film, we say 1 in 200, but I've actually seen 1 in 100 people.
I've seen 3 in 100. I've seen
Yeah.
anywhere from 100 to 1 to 3 in 100. I don't. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's so Jay, I would say, yeah, it tends to be misdiagnosed. There are a lot of, there is a stat that basically some people will go 8 or 9 years without being diagnosed or live with it without. So the fact that Shira was diagnosed so quickly, my daughter was diagnosed so quickly, certainly helps. So you were just talking about, now I lost my train of thought, values and dealing with different things in school. Did that help you, calm down? And when you have an anxious moment, are you able to sit with it or put it in perspective?
I'm working on it. It's something. I disclaimer, like I'm still working on this. It has been helping. It's a process, but it's definitely helped in the past weeks as school's sort of been ramping up. To think of it that way, and to think about other things, like when I'm so hyper focused on this one assignment, or that I have probably 2 hours of homework that night and I don't know how I'm going to manage it, I'll think about like, oh hey, like I have that one project I'm working on that's unrelated to school. I'm going to think about that for a little bit because it makes me happy, and it's something that is from me. It's something that is entirely motivated by me.
at the beginning of the year, do you or your parents sit down with some of your teachers and explain OCD to them and what's going on, so you understand, so they can kind of have a little better understanding about it?
Yeah, okay. So we do at my school, like, there's a whole series of meetings you have to go through in order to establish your accommodations. I'm actually on an IEP. And but I actually did this year. I wrote this handout to give to all my teachers about OCD, and there was a whole long overview of it that I put a lot of time into it, and I gave to my special ed counselor to give to my teachers. Whether or not they read it, I don't know. I think some of them did, some of them didn't. It's the beginning of the year; they're all busy. I'm open about it, so that's what I did.
That's great. We have always met with Vanessa's teachers beforehand. In fact, the middle school, we did a similar thing to what you would just explain. We met with her middle school advisor the day before school started and told her about OCD. And the teacher happens to be the humanities teacher, so she just emailed us early in this week. And there's like this video on the Civil War that we were going to watch with her this weekend because it has to deal with violence, and that usually gets Vanessa's anxiety up. So it kind of helps to have that relationship. So I would love to talk for a second. If you're just joining us, feel free to ask questions. Use that comment button. Shira has a really deep understanding about OCD and would be happy to share her knowledge. I would love to talk a little bit. You just spent a few months in residential treatment, and I would love to figure out, like, talk to me about what happened there, because there are a lot of parents that are, investigating it, thinking about it, those type of things. And, talk about your experience there.
Okay, so I should again put a disclaimer that the first time I attempted to go residential, I couldn't do it. I've had severe separation issues for my entire life, to the point where up until I went off to residential, I wasn't able to have a sleepover for the most part with my friends, because I was away from my parents for a night. Making the decision to commit to residential was, for me, and I know everyone's different, the best thing I think I've ever done for my mental health. Trying to think where to start, because it's pretty broad. When I got there, it was like, okay, like, when dealing with separation issues, it's cold turkey. It's okay. You're saying bye to your parents. You're in Massachusetts. They're flying back to Texas. You can talk to them once a week on the phone. Okay. Say goodbye. They're going back to Texas. And they went back to Texas, and I didn't talk to them for a week for the first time in my entire life. But I got used to it, and it wasn't as hard because there wasn't that temptation. Because I knew I wasn't able to contact them. So there wasn't that temptation to reach out, to use them as a safety blanket, and I adjusted.
You didn't have a phone. You couldn't pick up. You couldn't pick up the house phone.
No, not at all. I don't really know if there are more specific questions about what it actually was like, because a lot went on. I was there for 2.5 months, and then in their partial program for a month. So there's a lot.
So I have a very question. Like, I've heard that generally sometimes they'll have group activities as well as like your own activities that you have to do. When I mean activities, I mean like therapeutic things, exposure therapy. Talk about like maybe what a typical day was, or how they worked treatment in, and how that was, and how that was run.
I can give you the exact schedule, but basically, because I still remember it. In the morning we had a group, like a 45-minute group that was therapeutic, and like each day of the week, and it was different on weekends. Each day of the week we had a different kind of group. Like one day it was an ACT group, or one day it was a goals group where we made goals for the week. That's on Mondays. And then we'd have our ERP time. We'd have an individual ERP, or we'd have a self-directed ERP, which was where we worked on something individually that was challenging for us in our OCD. We'd have lunch, and then we'd have school in the afternoon. Work with the tutor. If we weren't in school, she'd have alternative stuff for us to do. So there's a way to get that done. We'd have another group in the afternoon, and then we'd have dinner, and after dinner we'd have one final self-directed exposure. And that was the therapeutic part of the day.
And because you had issues with perfectionism in schools, the tutoring part was also kind of therapy for you, I would imagine.
Yeah, and it was for a lot of kids. A lot of kids, whether, because it's quite common with kids, the perfectionism, whether or not it's about grades or about writing things just right or whatever it is, like OCD affects school and a lot, or school affects
Um,
OCD.
where were you doing activities like exposures together, like, you know, in the group therapy? So if one kid had an issue with contamination, were you helping out with like cleaning issues, or, you know, and they might help you out with not being perfect, things like that? Were the kids involved with each other's therapies?
You know, there was this period of time while I was there where they were experimenting with doing group exposures where kids would all, you know, like you just described, would do things like that. For the most part, there was a general rule to not get involved in other people's treatment unless because it could, you don't want to, like, if you don't know the whole story. The
Mm-hmm.
behavioral therapist knows the kid's story. So you don't want to be meddling in that. But so for the most part, we kept things separate.
Um, and you know, so it was kind of a regimented thing every day. And then you were in the, you said you were at first part, it sounded like you were in more of a structured environment for the first few months, and then you were in like a different environment or a step down unit the second half of the time. What was, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Okay. So the cool thing with the program I was in was that we had there was a residential program. You could be residential or you could be partial. When you're residential, obviously you were there 24/7. When you're partial, you were there for 6 hours a day during the weekdays. And what generally happened, if it was if it was possible, was that after you were in residential and your treatment team decided you could step down, you would step down to partial, and it was like a way slowly transitioning back into life. So I went from going 24 hours a day to 6 hours a day every day of the week for 4 weeks. And
And
it's
in
in
partial, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, it's in the same facility. You're still with the same kids. Just some of the kids go home at night.
Okay. And so at that point when you were in partial, I'm guessing your parents were with you at that time?
My mom was. My dad was at home still. So yeah.
And how did they reintroduce your parents with you? Because, you know, they didn't, you know, you had to, you clearly went through months where you were separated from them. So
Yeah.
that hit the separation anxiety right away. Did they kind of ease you in to meet your parents? Did you treat and talk to your parents about how to things to handle, educate them, so to speak?
Well, every week my behavioral therapist had a phone meeting with my parents to sort of go over my progress. And my parents actually visited 5 weeks into my stay. So my therapist prepared me with things that I wanted to address with them, and she prepared them for what was going on with my treatment. And then we had this initial meeting, and at first it was like we were both like, whoa, like this is weird, it's been 5 weeks. And of course it was even more bizarre when I stepped down and we readjusted to living together full time. But it was really work planning out in advance. Yeah.
There's a question here which I think I kind of know the answer to, but I'll let you have it. So, how are you dealing with OCD? Are there ways that you kind of get your mind off it, or creative expressions? You know, Jay's asking you a question about sports or music, working out, things like that. How are
Yeah.
some things that what do you do to kind of like, you know, get a release, or, you know, what do you do with your free time, and does it help with your mental health?
Yeah, no, this is like the biggest part of my life. That is, I'm a creative person. I need to be more active. I don't do sports right now. Any sort of exercise, I really need to be getting into that. But I do. I write poetry. While I was in residential, I actually wrote approximately 50 poems. Based on how I was feeling, what was going on, how OCD was affecting me. I also, and not very many people know this, I brought my ukulele to residential, and I would take it out in the evening. I have no idea if any of my friends from residential are watching this. If they are, they know what I'm talking about. But I would play ukulele at night, like we had this hour of free time before I went to bed, and I would sit around and play. But right now, it's mostly poetry, and I'm working on a book right now. I'm in the editing process.
Oh, wow. So you're working on a book that are the poems from what you, like based on the poems you wrote in treatment?
Yeah, I wrote about 55 poems from about right before I left to the very end of my stay in partial. And so I compiled all those, and I was like, I have enough for a book here. Like, there are like almost 60 poems here. And so I won't give away too much because I don't know exactly where I'm taking this. Obviously, I hope to get it published, but I've divided it into three. I identified three core topics that I had a tendency to write about, one of them being OCD, and sort of conceptualize this idea for a book. And I just finished writing my introduction right now.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's going.
Yeah. Well, if you'd like to read a poem or two, feel free. We'd love to hear it.
No, I forgot, but yeah.
Well, that's great. And if that, I think that even if the good news about the world today is if some publisher is dumb enough not to want to publish it, you can just publish it yourself.
Yeah, I know. That's pretty cool.
But I look forward to getting the book and reading your thoughts on that. And I know, I knew the creativity was a soft question for you because I've followed you online, so I know a lot of it had to do with drawing and seeing your singing, and poetry was a new thing that I learned about, which is great. But Jay, to answer your question, Shira is a very creative person. Yeah, that's a good question. What do you think about the future? What do you, and this is separate from mental health. Is your experience make you want to do that, or, does it affect how you're thinking?
It definitely affects how I'm thinking, and I think a lot of the things, the hobbies, the activities I do outside of school have been affected by my mental health, meaning that, like, I really got into poetry, I got into drawing, I got into writing music because I needed an outlet. Obviously, I did miss a year of school because of OCD, and so I'm a year behind where I was initially. But I hope to go to school for creative writing and psychology. I'm not sure which, maybe both. We'll see.
Well, that's great. So then I know I've taken up a lot of your time. Folks, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in right now. But I always love to kind of end talking about if there are any resources out there that you found helpful when you were, when things were tough, OCD related or not, that you could recommend people look at.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so obviously first is the IOCDF. If anyone needs resources, any resources, if you're looking for a therapist, a support group, any sort of clinician, they have somebody whose job it is to direct you to things. If you can't navigate the website, they've got resources in Spanish. They have everything. For kids, for teenagers, a book that helped me tremendously was Turtles All the Way Down by John Green, which is a book about a 16-year-old girl who has OCD. John Green himself has OCD. There's also a podcast done by Terry Gross talking to John Green about OCD and the book, which I recommend. I'm a big ACT person. I love the acceptance and commitment therapy. It's helped me a lot. So I recommend a book called Stuff That Sucks. I also recommend a book. Yeah, it's great. I also
It's called Stuff That Sucks?
Yeah. I also recommend Get Out of Your Minds and Into Your Life by Stephen Hayes. That's pretty good. Those are the things I can think of off the top of my head.
That's great.
Yeah.
We just picked up a book called The Goldfish Boy that we're going to look at. Allie read Turtles on the Way Down, loved it. I have only been able to read the first couple pages, although I liked it. I just haven't gotten to it yet.
Yeah.
But it's on the nightstand. And I know that John was He was one of the keynotes at one of the OCD conferences a few years ago.
Mhm.
And how? Let's just wrap it up by talking about, you're back into school now. Do you talk to your friends about OCD? If one of your friends says, "Oh, I'm so OCD about blank, blank, blank," how do you handle it?
I should say right now, most of my friends I've actually met through the OCD community. So it's, and as I'm sort of readjusting, I'm actually starting a new school this year. So I haven't really met a lot of people yet. So I don't really have that. Oh, the sun is getting, most of the time, I don't really have that issue. But when it does come up, when anyone does um, say something, a great thing happened, and by great I'm being sarcastic. I had my psychology teacher on the second day of class refer to himself as so OCD about something, and this was my psychology teacher. I didn't feel it was appropriate to say something to him, but if somebody says that's so OCD, I will kindly, in as civilized of a manner as I can in the moment, say, hey, like, that's not cool. Like, I'm very open about it. I was talking to someone earlier. I've sort of gotten past the point of, and it took a long time. Gotten past the point of really caring, like what people know, if they, because if someone doesn't accept that this thing that you can't help, then it's not someone that's worth your time. So, I mean, that's advice I'd give to anyone about anything.
No, I think there's something really profound and also freeing about that, because you go, I have to deal with me. Back to the point that your therapist made earlier with you about the things that you value, and that's important. And to understand, it takes a lot of people a lot of years, and some never get to that point that you just mentioned, where you understand that people necessarily aren't worth your time. Lenny, thank you for your comment. Susan, thank you. I think she'd be fantastic as a psychologist. All kids with OCD, I think, have a good understanding about that. We'll see if because Shira, you can be a psychologist, but also write and be creative. And hello, Deb. Thank you, everybody, for your comments. And we should show your therapist the film and see if he has a different opinion on it, being so OCD.
Yeah, we should.
Any last thoughts you want to leave the audience with, or anything you want to say before we end this and I let you go back to enjoying your Saturday?
I'm really grateful for this. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. If anyone knows a publisher, anyone who's interested in, let me know. I mean, I'm here. And I mean, I guess what you said about the resources, there are resources. Go to the IOCDF if you need help. Help's out there. That's what I got.
That's great. And I know that we will definitely see you in Austin. Next July.
Yeah.
And I know that we'll be communicating on social media between here and there. And tell your parents I said hello.
I will. They're watching right now. I know they're watching.
Of course.
Yeah.
At least you were able to get to the point where they're not watching in the same room, because I've done these where I could tell mom and dad are at, and the kid is always like, "What, mom? Okay."
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
You too.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I just want to let you know that why is this not working? We will be I'm going to be coming back in a few weeks to do another Kids Speak Out next month. But next month is OCD Awareness Month. I have a couple live streams. The film has a couple live streams coming up between the days of October 7th and October 13th. My daughters and I will be doing a live stream for the IOCDF on their page. We're going to be doing a live stream. Vanessa will be for Peace of Mind Foundation. So there's a lot coming on there. I'm also going to be doing a talk in about a week with a therapist named Dr. Allison Solomon. And we're going to talk about how to deal with insurance companies, and also about teletherapy, which is kind of like doing therapy via Skype or being FaceTime. So Definitely look forward to that, and thank you for joining. If you're watching this on the replay, feel free to add comments. Whenever you're watching this, we will answer. Thanks a lot. Have a good time, and I will see you next month with another Kids Speak Out.